Section 34 of the Book of Household Management. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. The Book of Household Management by Isabella Beeton. Section 34. Recipes. Chapter 15, Part 2. Italian Mutton Cutlets. 723. Ingredients: about 3 pounds of the neck of mutton, clarified butter, the yolk of 1 egg, 4 tablespoonfuls of breadcrumbs, 1 tablespoonful of minced savory herbs, 1 tablespoonful of minced parsley, 1 teaspoonful of minced shallot, 1 saltspoonful of finely chopped lemon peel, pepper, salt, and pounded mace to taste. Flour, half pint of hot broth or water, 2 teaspoonsful of Harvey's sauce, 1 teaspoonful of soy, 2 teaspoonfuls of tarragon vinegar, 1 tablespoonful of port wine. Mode. Cut the mutton into nicely shaped cutlets, flatten them, and trim off some of the fat. Dip them in clarified butter, and then into the beaten yolk of an egg. Mix well together breadcrumbs, herbs, parsley, shallot, lemon peel, and seasoning in the above proportion, and cover the cutlets with these ingredients. Melt some butter in a frying pan, lay in the cutlets, and fry them a nice brown. Take them out, and keep them hot before the fire. Dredge some flour into the pan, and if there is not sufficient butter, add a little more. Stir till it looks brown, then pour in the hot broth or water, and the remaining ingredients. Give one boil, and pour around the cutlets. If the gravy should not be thick enough, add a little more flour. Mushrooms, when obtainable, are a great improvement to this dish, and when not in season, mushroom powder may be substituted for them. Time. 10 minutes. Rather longer should the cutlets be very thick. Average cost, 2s. 9d. Sufficient for 5 or 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. The Downs, the well-known substance chalk, which the chemist regards as a nearly pure carbonate of lime, and the microscopist as an aggregation of inconceivably minute shells and corals, forms the subsoil of the hilly districts of the south-east of England. The chalk hills, known as the South Downs, start from the bold promontory of Beachy Head, traverse the country of Sussex from east to west, and pass through Hampshire into Surrey. The North Downs extend from Godalming by Godstone into Kent, and terminate in the line of cliffs which stretches from Dover to Ramsgate. The downs are clothed with short verdant turf, but the layer of soil which rests upon the chalk is too thin to support trees and shrubs. The hills have rounded summits, and their smooth, undulated outlines are unbroken, save by the sepulchral monuments of the early inhabitants of the country. The combes and furrows, which ramify and extend into deep valleys, appear like dried-up channels of streams and rivulets. From time immemorial, immense flocks of sheep have been reared on these downs. The herbage of these hills is remarkably nutritious, and whilst the natural healthiness of the climate, consequent on the dryness of the air and the moderate elevation of the land, is eminently favourable to rearing a superior race of sheep, the arable lands in the immediate neighbourhood of the downs affords the means of a supply of other food, when the natural produce of the hills fails. The mutton of the South Down breed of sheep is highly valued for its delicate flavour, and the wool for its fineness. But the best specimens of this breed, when imported from England into the West Indies, become miserably lean in the course of a year or two, and their woolly fleece gives place to a covering of short, crisp, brownish hair. Broiled kidneys, a breakfast or supper dish. 724. Ingredients: sheep kidneys, pepper, and salt to taste. Mode. Ascertain that the kidneys are fresh, and cut them open very evenly, lengthwise, down to the root; for should one half be thicker than the other, one would be underdone, whilst the other would be dried; but do not separate them. Skin them, and pass a skewer under the white part of each half to keep them flat, and broil over a nice clear fire, placing the inside downwards. Turn them when done enough on one side, and cook them on the other. Remove the skewers, place the kidneys on a very hot dish, season with pepper and salt, and put a tiny piece of butter in the middle of each. Serve very hot and quickly, and send very hot plates to table. Time. 6 to 8 minutes. Average cost, 1 1/2d. each. Sufficient. Allow 1 for each person. Seasonable at any time. Note. A prettier dish than the above may be made by serving the kidneys each on a piece of buttered toast out in any fanciful shape. In this case, a little lemon juice will be found an improvement. Fried kidneys. 725. INGREDIENTS. Kidneys, butter, pepper and salt to taste. Mode. Cut the kidneys open without quite dividing them. Remove the skin, and put a small piece of butter in the frying pan. When the butter is melted, lay in the kidneys the flat side downwards, and fry them for 7 or 8 minutes, turning them when they are half done. Serve on a piece of dry toast, season with pepper and salt, and put a small piece of butter in each kidney. Pour the gravy from the pan over them, and serve very hot. Time. 7 or 8 minutes. Average cost, 1 1/2d. each. Sufficient. Allow 1 kidney to each person. Seasonable at any time. Roast haunch of mutton. 726. INGREDIENTS. Haunch of mutton, a little salt, flour. Mode. Let this joint hang as long as possible without becoming tainted, and while hanging dust flour over it, which keeps off the flies, and prevents the air from getting to it. If not well hung, the joint, when it comes to table, will neither do credit to the butcher or the cook, as it will not be tender. Wash the outside well, lest it should have a bad flavour from keeping. Then flour it and put it down to a nice brisk fire, at some distance, so that it may gradually warm through. Keep continually basting, and about half an hour before it is served, draw it nearer to the fire to get nicely brown. Sprinkle a little fine salt over the meat, pour off the dripping, add a little boiling water slightly salted, and strain this over the joint. Place a paper ruche on the bone, and send red currant jelly and gravy in a tureen to table with it. Time. About 4 hours. Average cost, 9d. per pound. Sufficient for 8 to 10 persons. Seasonable in best season from September to March. How to buy meat economically. If the housekeeper is not very particular as to the precise joints to cook for dinner, there is oftentimes an opportunity for her to save as much money in her purchases of meat as will pay for the bread to eat it with. It often occurs, for instance, that the butcher may have a superfluity of certain joints, and these he would be glad to get rid of at a reduction of sometimes as much as 1d. or 1 1/2d. per pound, and thus in a joint of 8 or 9 pounds will be saved enough to buy 2 quartern loaves. It frequently happens with many butchers that, in consequence of a demand for legs and loins of mutton, they have only shoulders left, and these they will be glad to sell at a reduction. Roast leg of mutton. [Illustration: Leg of mutton.] 727. INGREDIENTS. Leg of mutton, a little salt. Mode. As mutton, when freshly killed, is never tender, hang it almost as long as it will keep, flour it, and put it in a cool, airy place for a few days, if the weather will permit. Wash off the flour, wipe it very dry, and cut off the shank bone. Put it down to a brisk, clear fire, dredge with flour, and keep continually basting the whole time it is cooking. About 20 minutes before serving, draw it near to the fire to get nicely brown. Sprinkle over it a little salt, dish the meat, pour off the dripping, add some boiling water, slightly salted, strain it over the joint, and serve. Time. A leg of mutton weighing 10 pounds, about 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 hours. One of 7 pounds, about 2 hours or rather less. Average cost, 8 1/2d. per pound. Sufficient. A moderate sized leg of mutton, sufficient for 6 or 8 persons. Seasonable at any time, but not so good in June, July, and August. Roast loin of mutton. 728. INGREDIENTS. Loin of mutton, a little salt. Mode. Cut and trim off the superfluous fat, and see that the butcher joints the meat properly, as thereby much annoyance is saved to the carver when it comes to table. Have ready a nice clear fire. It need not be a very wide, large one. Put down the meat, dredge with flour, and baste well until it is done. Make the gravy as for roast leg of mutton, and serve very hot. Time. A loin of mutton weighing 6 pounds, 1 1/2 hour or rather longer. Average cost, 8 1/2d. per pound. Sufficient for 4 or 5 persons. Seasonable at any time. Rolled loin of mutton. Very excellent. 729. INGREDIENTS. About 6 pounds of a loin of mutton, half teaspoonful of pepper, 1/4 teaspoonful of pounded allspice, 1/4 teaspoonful of mace, 1/4 teaspoonful of nutmeg, 6 cloves, forcemeat No. 417, 1 glass of port wine, 2 tablespoonfuls of mushroom ketchup. Mode. Hang the mutton till tender, bone it, and sprinkle over it pepper, mace, cloves, allspice, and nutmeg in the above proportion, all of which must be pounded very fine. Let it remain for a day, then make a forcemeat by recipe No. 417. Cover the meat with it, and roll and bind it up firmly. Half bake it in a slow oven, let it grow cold, take off the fat, and put the gravy into a stewpan. Flour the meat, put it in the gravy, and stew it till perfectly tender. Now take out the meat, unbind it, add to the gravy wine and ketchup as above, give one boil, and pour over the meat. Serve with red currant jelly, and, if obtainable, a few mushrooms, stewed for a few minutes in the gravy, will be found a great improvement. Time. 1 1/2 hour to bake the meat, 1 1/2 hour to stew gently. Average cost, 4s. 9d. Sufficient for 5 or 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. Note. This joint will be found very nice if rolled and stuffed, as here directed, and plainly roasted. It should be well basted, and served with a good gravy and currant jelly. Boiled neck of mutton. 730. INGREDIENTS. 4 pounds of the middle or best end of the neck of mutton, a little salt. Mode. Trim off a portion of the fat, should there be too much, and if it is to look particularly nice, the chine bone should be sawn down, the ribs stripped halfway down, and the ends of the bones chopped off. This is, however, not necessary. Put the meat into sufficient boiling water to cover it. When it boils, add a little salt and remove all the scum. Draw the saucepan to the side of the fire, and let the water get so cool that the finger may be borne in it. Then simmer very slowly and gently until the meat is done, which will be in about 1 1/2 hour, or rather more, reckoning from the time that it begins to simmer. Serve with turnips and caper sauce, No. 382, and pour a little of it over the meat. The turnips should be boiled with the mutton, and, when at hand, a few carrots will also be found an improvement. These, however, if very large and thick, must be cut into long, thinnish pieces, or they will not be sufficiently done by the time the mutton is ready. Garnish the dish with carrots and turnips placed alternately round the mutton. Time. 4 pounds of the neck of mutton, about 1 1/2 hour. Average cost, 8 1/2d. per pound. Sufficient for 6 or 7 persons. Seasonable at any time. The poets on sheep. The keeping of flocks seems to have been the first employment of mankind. and the most ancient sort of poetry was probably pastoral. The poem known as the Pastoral gives a picture of the life of the simple shepherds of the Golden Age, who are supposed to have beguiled their time in singing. In all pastorals, repeated allusions are made to the fleecy flocks, the milk-white lambs, and the tender ewes. Indeed, the sheep occupy a position in these poems inferior only to that of the shepherds who tend them. The nibbling sheep has ever been a favorite of the poets, and has supplied them with figures and similes without end. Shakespeare frequently compares men to sheep. When Gloucester rudely drives the lieutenant from the side of Henry VI., the poor king thus touchingly speaks of his helplessness: "So flies the reckless shepherd from the wolf, so first the harmless sheep doth yield his fleece, and next his throat unto the butcher's knife." In the Two Gentlemen of Verona we meet with the following humorous comparison: Proteus: "The sheep for fodder follow the shepherd; the shepherd for food follows not the sheep; thou for wages followest thy master; thy master for wages follows not thee; therefore thou art a sheep." Speed: "Such another proof will make me cry, Bah!" The descriptive poets give us some charming pictures of sheep. Every one is familiar with the sheep shearing scene in Thomson's Seasons. Heavy and dripping to the breezy brow, slow move the harmless race, where, as they spread their dwelling treasures to the sunny ray, inly disturbed, and wondering what this wild outrageous tumult means, their loud complaints the country fill, and tossed from rock to rock incessant bleatings run around the hills. What an exquisite idea of stillness is conveyed in the oft quoted line from Gray's Elegy: "And drowsy tinklings lull the distant fold." From Dyer's quaint poem of the Fleece we could cull 100 passages relating to sheep. But we have already exceeded our space. We cannot, however, close this brief notice of the allusions that have been made to sheep by our poets without quoting a couple of verses from Robert Burns's Elegy on Poor Mally, his only pet yow. "Through a' the town she trolled by him, a lang half-mile she could descry him; wi' kindly bleat when she did spy him, she ran wi' speed. A friend mair faithful ne'er came nigh him, then Mally died. I wot she was a sheep o' sense, and could behave herself wi' mense; I'll say it, she never brake a fence, though thievish greed, our Barty Laney, keeps the spence, sin' Mally's dead." Mutton Collops (Cold Meat Cookery). 731. INGREDIENTS. A few slices of a cold leg or loin of mutton, salt and pepper to taste, 1 blade of pounded mace, 1 small bunch of savoury herbs minced very fine, 2 or 3 shallots, 2 or 3 ounces of butter, 1 dessertspoonful of flour, 1/2 pint of gravy, 1 tablespoonful of lemon juice. Mode. Cut some very thin slices from a leg or the chump end of a loin of mutton. Sprinkle them with pepper, salt, pounded mace, minced savoury herbs, and minced shallot. Fry them in butter, stir in a dessertspoonful of flour, add the gravy and lemon juice, simmer very gently about 5 or 7 minutes, and serve immediately. Time. 5 to 7 minutes. Average cost, exclusive of the meat, 6d. Seasonable at any time. Mutton cutlets with mashed potatoes. 732. INGREDIENTS. About 3 pounds of the best end of the neck of mutton, salt and pepper to taste, mashed potatoes. Mode. Procure a well hung neck of mutton, saw off about 3 inches of the top of the bones, and cut the cutlets of a moderate thickness. Shape them by chopping off the thick part of the chine bone, beat them flat with a cutlet chopper, and scrape quite clean a portion of the top of the bone. Broil them over a nice clear fire for about 7 or 8 minutes, and turn them frequently. Have ready some smoothly mashed white potatoes, place these in the middle of the dish. When the cutlets are done, season with pepper and salt. Arrange them round the potatoes, with the thick end of the cutlets downwards. and serve very hot and quickly. Time. 7 or 8 minutes. Average cost for this quantity, 2s. 4d. Sufficient for 5 or 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. Note. Cutlets may be served in various ways, with peas, tomatoes, onions, sauce piquante, etc. Mutton pie, cold meat cookery. 733. INGREDIENTS. The remains of a cold leg, loin, or neck of mutton, pepper and salt to taste, 2 blades of pounded mace, 1 dessertspoonful of chopped parsley, 1 teaspoonful of minced savoury herbs, when liked a little minced onion or shallot, 3 or 4 potatoes, 1 teacupful of gravy crust. Mode. Cold mutton may be made into very good pies if well seasoned and mixed with a few herbs. If the leg is used, cut it into very thin slices; if the loin or neck, into thin cutlets. Place some at the bottom of the dish. Season well with pepper, salt, mace, parsley, and herbs. Then put a layer of potatoes sliced, then more mutton, and so on till the dish is full. Add the gravy, cover with a crust, and bake for 1 hour. Time. 1 hour. Seasonable at any time. Note. The remains of an underdone leg of mutton may be converted into a very good family pudding by cutting the meat into slices and putting them into a basin lined with a suet crust. It should be seasoned well with pepper, salt, and minced shallot, covered with a crust, and boiled for about 3 hours. Mutton pie. 734. INGREDIENTS. 2 lbs of the neck or loin of mutton, weighed after being boned, 2 kidneys, pepper and salt to taste, 2 teacupfuls of gravy, or water, 2 tablespoonfuls of minced parsley, when liked a little minced onion or shallot, puff crust. Mode. Bone the mutton, and cut the meat into steaks all of the same thickness, and leave but very little fat. Cut up the kidneys, and arrange these with the meat neatly in a pie dish. Sprinkle over them the minced parsley and a seasoning of pepper and salt. Pour in the gravy, and cover with a tolerably good puff crust. Bake for 1 1/2 hour, or rather longer, should the pie be very large, and let the oven be rather brisk. A well-made suet crust may be used instead of puff crust, and will be found exceedingly good. Time. 1 1/2 hour, or rather longer. Average cost, 2s. Sufficient for 6 or 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. Mutton pudding. 735. INGREDIENTS. About 2 lbs of the chump end of the loin of mutton, weighed after being boned, pepper and salt to taste, suet crust made with milk (see pastry), in the proportion of 6 oz. of suet to each pound of flour, a very small quantity of minced onion. This may be omitted when the flavour is not liked. Mode. Cut the meat into rather thin slices, and season them with pepper and salt. Line the pudding dish with crust, lay in the meat, and nearly, but do not quite, fill it up with water. When the flavour is liked, add a small quantity of minced onion, cover with crust, and proceed in the same manner as directed in recipe No. 605, using the same kind of pudding dish as there mentioned. Time. About 3 hours. Average cost, 1s. 9d. Sufficient for 6 persons. Seasonable all the year, but more suitable in winter. Ragout of cold neck of mutton. Cold meat cookery. 736. INGREDIENTS. The remains of a cold neck or loin of mutton, 2 oz. of butter, a little flour, 2 onions sliced, 1/4 pint of water, 2 small carrots, 2 turnips, pepper and salt to taste. Mode. Cut the mutton into small chops, and trim off the greater portion of the fat. Put the butter into a stewpan, dredge in a little flour, add the sliced onions, and keep stirring till brown. Then put in the meat. When this is quite brown, add the water, and the carrots and turnips, which should be cut into very thin slices. Season with pepper and salt, and stew till quite tender, which will be in about 3/4 of an hour. When in season, green peas may be substituted for the carrots and turnips. They should be piled in the centre of the dish, and the chops laid round. Time. 3/4 of an hour. Average cost, exclusive of the meat, 4d. Seasonable, with peas, from June to August. Roast neck of mutton. 737. INGREDIENTS. Neck of mutton, a little salt. Mode. For roasting, choose the middle or the best end of the neck of mutton, and if there is a very large proportion of fat, trim off some of it, and save it for making into suet puddings, which will be found exceedingly good. Let the bones be cut short, and see that it is properly jointed before it is laid down to the fire, as they will be more easily separated when they come to table. Place the joint at a nice brisk fire, dredge it with flour, and keep continually basting until done. A few minutes before serving, draw it nearer to the fire to acquire a nice colour, sprinkle over it a little salt, pour off the dripping, add a little boiling water, slightly salted, strain this over the meat, and serve. Red currant jelly may be sent to table with it. Time. 4 lbs of the neck of mutton, rather more than 1 hour. Average cost, 8 1/2d. per pound. Sufficient for 4 or 5 persons. Seasonable at any time. Woollen manufactures. The distinction between hair and wool is rather arbitrary than natural, consisting in the greater or less degrees of fineness, softness, and pliability of the fibres. When the fibres possess these properties so far as to admit of their being spun and woven into a texture sufficiently pliable to be used as an article of dress, they are called wool. The sheep, llama, Angora goat, and the goat of Tibet are the animals from which most of the wool used in manufactures is obtained. The finest of all wools is that from the goat of Tibet, of which the cashmere shawls are made. Of European wools, the finest is that yielded by the merino sheep, the Spanish and Saxon breeds taking the precedence. The merino sheep, as now naturalized in Australia, furnishes an excellent fleece, but all varieties of sheep wool, reared either in Europe or Australia, are inferior in softness of feel to that grown in India, and to that of the llama of the Andes. The best of our British wools are inferior in fineness to any of the above mentioned, being nearly 12 times the thickness of the finest Spanish merino, but for the ordinary purposes of the manufacturer they are unrivalled. Roast saddle of mutton. 738. INGREDIENTS. Saddle of mutton, a little salt. Mode. To insure this joint being tender, let it hang for 10 days or a fortnight, if the weather permits. Cut off the tail and flaps, and trim away every part that has not indisputable pretensions to be eaten, and have the skin taken off and skewered on again. Put it down to a bright clear fire, and, when the joint has been cooking for an hour, remove the skin and dredge it with flour. It should not be placed too near the fire, as the fat should not be in the slightest degree burnt. Keep constantly basting, both before and after the skin is removed. Sprinkle some salt over the joint. Make a little gravy in the dripping pan. Pour it over the meat, which send to table with a tureen of made gravy and red currant jelly. Time. A saddle of mutton weighing 10 lbs, 2 1/2 hours; 14 lbs, 3 1/4 hours. When liked underdone, allow rather less time. Average cost, 10d. per pound. Sufficient. A moderate sized saddle of 10 lbs for 7 or 8 persons. Seasonable all the year. Not so good when lamb is in full season. Roast shoulder of mutton. 739. INGREDIENTS. Shoulder of mutton, a little salt. Mode. Put the joint down to a bright clear fire, flour it well, and keep continually basting. About a quarter hour before serving, draw it near the fire, that the outside may acquire a nice brown colour, but not sufficiently near to blacken the fat. Sprinkle a little fine salt over the meat, empty the dripping pan of its contents, pour in a little boiling water slightly salted, and strain this over the joint. Onion sauce, or stewed Spanish onions, are usually sent to table with this dish, and sometimes baked potatoes. Time. A shoulder of mutton weighing 6 or 7 pounds, 1 1/2 hour. Average cost, 9d. per pound. Sufficient for 5 or 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. Note. Shoulder of mutton may be dressed in a variety of ways: boiled, and served with onion sauce; boned, and stuffed with a good veal forcemeat; or baked, with sliced potatoes in the dripping pan. The Ettrick Shepherd. James Hogg was perhaps the most remarkable man that ever wore the mod of a shepherd. Under the garb, aspect, and bearing of a rude peasant, and rude enough he was in most of these things, even after no inconsiderable experience of society, the world soon discovered a true poet. He taught himself to write by copying the letters of a printed book as he lay watching his flock on the hillside, and believed that he had reached the utmost pitch of his ambition when he first found that his artless rhymes could touch the heart of the ewe-milker who partook the shelter of his mantle during the passing storm. If the Shepherd of Professor Wilson's Nocturnes Ambrosianae may be taken as a true portrait of James Hogg, we must admit that, for quaintness of humour, the poet of Ettrick Forest had few rivals. Sir Walter Scott said that Hogg's 1,000 little touches of absurdity afforded him more entertainment than the best comedy that ever set the pit in a roar. Among the written productions of the shepherd poet is an account of his own experiences in sheep tending, called The Shepherd's Calendar. This work contains a vast amount of useful information upon sheep, their diseases, habits, and management. The Ettrick Shepherd died in 1835. Sheep's brains en matelotte, an entrée. 740. INGREDIENTS. 6 sheep's brains, vinegar, salt, a few slices of bacon, 1 small onion, 2 cloves, a small bunch of parsley, sufficient stock or weak broth to cover the brains, 1 tablespoonful of lemon juice, matelotte sauce, No. 512. Mode. Detach the brains from the heads without breaking them, and put them into a pan of warm water. Remove the skin, and let them remain for 2 hours. Have ready a saucepan of boiling water, add a little vinegar and salt, and put in the brains. When they are quite firm, take them out, and put them into very cold water. Place 2 or 3 slices of bacon in a stewpan, put in the brains, the onions stuck with 2 cloves, the parsley, and a good seasoning of pepper and salt, cover with stock or weak broth, and boil them gently for about 25 minutes. Have ready some croutons. Arrange these in the dish alternately with the brains, and cover with a matelotte sauce, No. 512, to which has been added the above proportion of lemon juice. Time. 25 minutes. Average cost, 1s. 6d. Sufficient for 6 persons. Seasonable at any time. Sheep's feet or trotters. Sawyer's recipe. 741. INGREDIENTS. 12 feet, 1/4 pound of beef or mutton suet, 2 onions, 1 carrot, 2 bay leaves, 2 sprigs of thyme, 1 oz. of salt, 1/4 oz. of pepper, 2 tablespoonfuls of flour, 2 1/2 quarts of water, 1/4 pound of fresh butter, 1 teaspoonful of salt, 1 teaspoonful of flour, 3/4 teaspoonful of pepper, a little grated nutmeg, the juice of 1 lemon, 1 gill of milk, the yolks of 2 eggs. Mode. Have the feet cleaned, and the long bone extracted from them. Put the suet into a stewpan with the onions and carrot sliced, the bay leaves, thyme, salt, and pepper, and let these simmer for 5 minutes. Add 2 tablespoonfuls of flour and the water, and keep stirring till it boils, then put in the feet. Let these simmer for 3 hours, or until perfectly tender, and take them and lay them on a sieve. Mix together on a plate, with the back of the spoon, butter, salt, flour, 1 teaspoonful, pepper, nutmeg, and lemon juice as above, and put the feet with a gill of milk into a stewpan. When very hot, add the butter, etc., and stir continually till melted. Now mix the yolks of 2 eggs with 5 tablespoonfuls of milk. Stir this to the other ingredients. Keep moving the pan over the fire continually for a minute or two, but do not allow it to boil after the eggs are added. Serve in a very hot dish, and garnish with croutons, or sippets of toasted bread. Time. 3 hours. Average cost, 1s. 6d. Sufficient for 4 persons. Seasonable at any time. To dress a sheep's head. 742. INGREDIENTS. 1 sheep's head, sufficient water to cover it, 3 carrots, 3 turnips, 2 or 3 parsnips, 3 onions, a small bunch of parsley, 1 teaspoonful of pepper, 3 teaspoonfuls of salt, 1/4 lb. of Scotch oatmeal. Mode. Clean the head well, and let it soak in warm water for 2 hours, to get rid of the blood. Put it into a saucepan, with sufficient cold water to cover it, and when it boils, add the vegetables, peeled and sliced, and the remaining ingredients, before adding the oatmeal. Mix it to a smooth batter with a little of the liquor. Keep stirring till it boils up. Then shut the saucepan closely, and let it stew gently for 1½ or 2 hours. It may be thickened with rice or barley, but oatmeal is preferable. Time. 1½ or 2 hours. Average cost, 8d. each. Sufficient for 3 persons. Seasonable at any time. Singed sheep's head. The village of Duddingston, which stands within a mile of Edinburgh town, was formerly celebrated for this ancient and homely Scottish dish. In the summer months, many opulent citizens used to resort to this place to solace themselves over singed sheep's heads, boiled or baked. The sheep fed upon the neighbouring hills were slaughtered at this village, and the carcasses were sent to town, but the heads were left to be consumed in the place. We are not aware whether the custom of eating sheep's heads at Dudingston is still kept up by the good folks of Edinburgh. Toad in the hole. Cold meat cookery. 743. INGREDIENTS. 6 ounces of flour, 1 pint of milk, 3 eggs, butter, a few slices of cold mutton, pepper and salt to taste, 2 kidneys. Mode. Make a smooth batter of flour, milk, and eggs in the above proportion. Butter a baking dish, and pour in the batter. Into this place a few slices of cold mutton, previously well seasoned, and the kidneys, which should be cut into rather small pieces. Bake about 1 hour, or rather longer, and send it to table in the dish it was baked in. Oysters and mushrooms may be substituted for the kidneys, and will be found exceedingly good. Time. Rather more than 1 hour. Average cost, exclusive of the cold meat, 8d. Seasonable at any time. End of Section 34. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, in Concord, New Hampshire.